Hello there, and welcome to Sleep Orion. Tonight, we journey to one of the most extraordinary tales of human endurance ever told. A story written in the crushing ice of the Weddell Sea, where 28 men faced the unimaginable and survived against odds that seemed insurmountable. This is the story of the Endurance, Ernest Shackleton's ship, and the months when time itself seemed to freeze alongside the vessel trapped in Antarctica's merciless grip. It is a story of leadership and loyalty, of quiet courage in the face of absolute desolation, and of men who refused to surrender even when the world around them turned to ice and darkness. Before we begin, if you enjoy these journeys into history's most remarkable moments, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments. It helps others find their way here too, one sleepy soul at a time. For now, settle in. Let the outside world fade. And let us travel back to 1914, to the age when the blank spaces on maps still called to restless hearts, and one man dared to dream of walking across the bottom of the world. Let's begin. By 1914, Ernest Shackleton had already lived several lifetimes of adventure. Born in Ireland in 1874, he had gone to sea at 16, joined Robert Falcon Scott's Discovery expedition to Antarctica in 1901, and then led his own Nimrod expedition from 1907 to 1909. That journey had brought him within 97 miles of the South Pole, closer than any human being had ever ventured, before supply shortages forced him to turn back. He returned to England not as a failure, but as a hero who had chosen the lives of his men over personal glory. But the world of polar exploration moved quickly in those days. In 1911, Roald Amundsen reached the South Pole, planting the Norwegian flag in that white emptiness. Weeks later, Robert Scott arrived at the same spot, only to discover he had been beaten. Scott and his companions perished on their return journey, their frozen bodies discovered by a search party the following spring. The tragedy shocked the world, but it also marked an end. The race to the poles was over. The great prize had been claimed. Yet Shackleton saw something else. Where others saw closure, he saw possibility. There remained, he declared, one great main object of Antarctic journeyings still unachieved. No one had ever crossed the Antarctic continent from sea to sea. No one had walked from the Weddell Sea, across the polar plateau, over the South Pole itself, and down through the mountains to the Ross Sea on the opposite side. It would be a journey of nearly 1,800 miles across the most hostile environment on Earth. This would be his Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. The name carried weight and ambition. Shackleton envisioned an endeavor that would unite the British Empire, drawing support from all corners of the King's dominions. He imagined a carefully choreographed operation involving 2 ships and 2 parties. His ship, Endurance, would carry him and his team to the Weddell Sea side of Antarctica. They would establish a base camp near Vassal Bay and from there begin the transcontinental crossing. Meanwhile, a second ship, Aurora, would sail to the Ross Sea on the opposite side of the continent. That party, under the command of Aeneas Mackintosh, would lay supply depots along the route from McMurdo Sound toward the South Pole, ensuring that when Shackleton's crossing party emerged from the polar plateau, they would have the provisions needed to complete their journey. It was an elegant plan on paper. In practice, it required extraordinary coordination, substantial funding, and more than a little luck. Shackleton threw himself into the preparations with characteristic energy. He needed £50,000, a fortune in 1914. The British government, after some persuasion, contributed £10,000. A wealthy tobacco heiress named Janet Stancombe Wills donated generously, though the exact amount was never publicly disclosed. The decisive contribution came from Sir James Key Caird, a Scottish industrialist who gave £24,000, relieving Shackleton, as he put it, of all anxiety about funding. With money secured, Shackleton turned his attention to acquiring ships. He found what he needed in a Norwegian barquentine named Polaris, built for Belgian explorer Adrian de Gerlache but never used for its intended expedition to Spitsbergen. Shackleton purchased her for £14,000, renamed her Endurance after his family motto, "By endurance we conquer," and set about outfitting her for the most extreme conditions imaginable. The ship was 144 feet long, built with extra thick planking to withstand ice pressure, and equipped with a 350 horsepower coal-fired steam engine. For the Ross Sea party, he acquired Douglas Mawson's old ship, Aurora, which lay idle in Hobart, Tasmania. Choosing his crew proved easier than raising the money. According to legend, Shackleton placed an advertisement in London newspapers that read, "Men wanted for hazardous journey. Low wages, bitter cold, long hours of complete darkness. Safe return doubtful. Honor and recognition in event of success." Though no copy of this advertisement has ever been found and most historians consider it apocryphal, the sentiment captured something true about the enterprise. This would be no pleasure cruise. Shackleton received more than 5,000 applications. From this flood of eager volunteers, he selected 27 men to accompany him on Endurance. The crew represented a careful balance of experience and expertise. For his second-in-command, Shackleton chose Frank Wild, a quiet, deeply capable man who had accompanied him on both the Discovery and Nimrod expeditions. Wild had been one of the 4 men who had marched to within 97 miles of the South Pole in 1909. He was unflappable in crisis, loyal to his corps, and possessed a dry wit that would prove invaluable during the dark months ahead. As captain of Endurance, Shackleton appointed Frank Worsley, a New Zealander with an extraordinary gift for navigation. Worsley would later claim he learned of the expedition in a dream and immediately sought out Shackleton to volunteer. Whether divine inspiration or simple enthusiasm, Worsley's presence proved essential. His ability to calculate their position using a sextant under the most adverse conditions, taking sun sights from the heaving deck of a small boat in Antarctic waters, would later help save every man aboard. Tom Crean signed on as second officer, taking a leave of absence from the Royal Navy. Crean was already legendary in polar circles. He had served with both Scott and Shackleton on previous expeditions and had been awarded the Albert Medal for saving the life of Lieutenant Edward Evans during Scott's final, fatal journey. Crean stood well over 6 feet tall, possessed the strength of 3 ordinary men, and harbored a gentleness that made him beloved by the crew. He had a particular way with the expedition's dogs, and the animals responded to him as they did to no one else. The scientific staff numbered 6 men. Alexander Macklin and James McIlroy served as surgeons, though their duties would extend far beyond medical care. James Wordie came aboard as geologist, Robert Clark as biologist, Reginald James as physicist, and Leonard Hussey as meteorologist. Hussey, the youngest of the scientists, also served as the expedition's banjo player, a role that would prove more important to morale than anyone initially imagined. Frank Hurley joined as official photographer and cinematographer. The Australian was already famous for his images from Douglas Mawson's Australasian Antarctic expedition. Hurley's photographs would become the expedition's most enduring legacy, capturing both the beauty and terror of their ordeal with stark clarity. Among the other crew members, several would leave their mark on the story in ways large and small. Harry McNish served as carpenter, a Dorr Scott whose skill with wooden tools would prove essential but whose stubbornness would create one of the expedition's few moments of serious discord. Alfred Cheetham, at 54 the oldest crew member, was a veteran of multiple Antarctic expeditions. Pierce Blackborough, a young Welsh sailor, initially had his application rejected but managed to stow away in Buenos Aires, hiding among the cargo until they were too far at sea for Shackleton to turn back. When discovered, the explorer gruffly told him that stowaways were traditionally the first to be eaten if supplies ran short. Blackborough reportedly replied that if it came to that, the officers would certainly be tastier. The ship departed Plymouth on August 8, 1914. Europe had just descended into war. Britain had declared war on Germany only 4 days earlier, and the world Shackleton's crew left behind was already beginning to tear itself apart. The explorer had offered to place his ship and men at the service of the military, but the Admiralty, through the intervention of Winston Churchill, sent a one-word telegram: proceed. And so they did, sailing away from civilization just as it seemed civilization itself might be ending. Endurance called first at Buenos Aires, where Shackleton rejoined the ship after handling final business matters in England. Here Hurley came aboard, along with William Bakewell, an American sailor, and the stowaway Blackborough. The ship departed Buenos Aires on October 26, sailing south across increasingly cold and hostile seas toward their last port of call before Antarctica. They reached South Georgia on November 5, 1914. This mountainous island, home to several whaling stations, would be their final taste of human habitation for what everyone assumed would be about 18 months. The expedition's plan called for Endurance to drop the shore party at Vassal Bay, then return to South Georgia for the winter before attempting to meet Shackleton's crossing party on the other side of the continent the following year. At the Grytviken whaling station, the Norwegian whalers warned Shackleton that the ice conditions in the Weddell Sea were the worst they had seen in living memory. The pack ice had pushed unusually far north. Old hands who had spent decades hunting whales in those waters shook their heads and urged caution. Shackleton listened to their warnings with respect but remained undeterred. He had faced ice before and had always found a way through. On December 5, 1914, Endurance steamed out of Grytviken harbor and turned south toward the Antarctic Circle. The mountains of South Georgia receded behind them, and ahead lay nothing but cold ocean and the promise of ice. Those first days after leaving South Georgia carried a sense of excitement mixed with apprehension. The crew settled into shipboard routine. Men stood watches, maintained the engine, adjusted sails when conditions allowed. The scientists began their observations, recording water temperatures and collecting samples of the strange life forms that drifted in the frigid waters. Hurley set up his cameras and darkroom, eager to capture every stage of the journey. The dogs, 69 of them in all, howled and barked in their kennels on deck, sensing the adventure ahead even if they could not comprehend its scope. But the excitement began to fade on December 7th, just 2 days after leaving South Georgia. That morning, Lookout spotted pack ice at latitude 57 degrees, 26 minutes south. This was much further north than anyone had expected or hoped. The Weddell Sea was notorious for its ice, but typically ships could push well past 60 degrees before encountering serious obstacles. Finding substantial pack this far north suggested that the Norwegian whalers' warnings had been, if anything, understated. Worsley, on the bridge with Shackleton, studied the ice field stretching before them. It was not solid, not yet. Leads of open water snaked through the pack, dark channels between the white floes. But already it required careful navigation, threading Endurance through the openings, sometimes backing the engine to avoid dead ends. The ship's wooden hull, reinforced as it was, would not stand up to a direct collision with heavy ice at speed. For the next several weeks, progress became a frustrating cycle of advance and delay. They would find a lead and follow it for miles, making good speed, only to have it close ahead of them. Then came the tedious process of backing, turning, searching for another route. Sometimes they were stopped for hours or even a full day, drifting with the pack while waiting for the ice to shift enough to reveal a passage. On December 14th, the ship was held completely motionless for 24 hours by dense pack. Shackleton wrote in his journal that he had been prepared for difficult conditions in the Weddell Sea but had hoped the pack would be loose and navigable. What they encountered was dense ice of an obstinate character, ice that seemed to resist their every attempt to push through. But then, on December 22nd, the pack opened up as suddenly as it had closed. Leads appeared in all directions. Endurance surged forward, her engine running at full power, her bow cutting through thin ice with ease. For 2 glorious weeks they made steady progress southward, covering hundreds of miles, penetrating deep into the Weddell Sea. The men's spirit soared. At this rate they would reach Vassal Bay well ahead of schedule. The year turned. 1915 arrived with the ship still steaming south through increasingly heavy ice but continuing to find ways through. On January 7th, a long run carried them close to the coast of Coates Land, where immense ice cliffs rose from the sea. This territory had been discovered and named by Scottish explorer William Speirs Bruce in 1904. Now Shackleton and his men gazed upon those cliffs, so close to their goal. On January 15th, they came upon a great glacier whose edge formed a promising bay. For a moment Shackleton considered landing there, establishing their base camp and beginning the transcontinental march immediately. But the location was too far north of Vassal Bay, perhaps 60 miles or more. Starting the crossing from here would add distance and difficulty to an already daunting journey. With what he would later recognize as tragic optimism, Shackleton decided to continue south to their planned destination. Except under pressure of necessity, he wrote, this bay would not serve as their landing place. 2 days later, on January 17th, Endurance reached latitude 76 degrees, 27 minutes south. Land was faintly visible in the distance, a mountainous coastline that Shackleton named Caird Coast in honor of his principal financial backer. Bad weather forced the ship to shelter in the lee of a massive stranded iceberg, and for a day and a night they waited there, the hull creaking as smaller ice floes bumped against it. They were so close now. Vassal Bay lay somewhere just beyond that coastline, perhaps only 20 or 30 miles away. One good push, one final stretch of clear water, and they would reach their destination. But the ice had other plans. On January 18, 1915, the pack closed around them. It happened gradually at first, almost imperceptibly. The leads that had been open in the morning narrowed by afternoon. By evening they had disappeared entirely. Endurance found herself surrounded by ice in all directions, held fast in a grip that would not release. Worsley noted their position, 76 degrees, 34 minutes south, 31 degrees, 30 minutes west. For the next 24 hours the crew worked desperately to free the ship. They fired up the engine to full power, trying to force a passage. They sent men onto the ice with ice chisels, prickers, saws, and picks, attempting to cut channels through which the ship might advance. But their efforts proved futile. The ice was too thick, too extensive, too solid. Every channel they cut closed behind them as quickly as they carved it. Every lead they found ended in a wall of ice too massive to break. On January 19th, Shackleton ordered the fires banked to conserve coal. The immediate crisis of being stuck had become something else, something more serious. They were not merely stopped. They were beset, the old sailing term for a ship trapped in ice with no immediate prospect of escape. This was a dangerous situation but not yet desperate. Ships had been beset before and eventually freed. Deutschland, a German ship under Wilhelm Filchner, had been caught in nearly this same location 3 years earlier. That ship had been held fast for 6 months before the ice finally released it, and the vessel had sailed away undamaged. Shackleton clung to this precedent. If Filchner's ship had survived, so too could Endurance. They would wait out the winter, frozen in place, and when the spring sun returned and temperatures rose, the pack would break up and they could continue south to Vassal Bay. They might be delayed by 6 months, perhaps a year, but the transcontinental crossing could still happen. The crew, taking their cue from their leader, adapted to the new reality with remarkable resilience. Routines were abandoned. The ship's interior, which had been organized for sailing, was rearranged for winter habitation. Partitions were erected to create more private spaces. The scientists established laboratories in various corners of the vessel. The forecastle, where the seamen bunked, was decorated with pin-up pictures and keepsakes from home. The 69 dogs, which had lived in kennels on deck while the ship was underway, were moved onto the ice surrounding Endurance. The crew built elaborate shelters for them, half-buried snow structures that came to be called dogloos. Each dog had its own named igloo, and the crew took great pride in their construction. The animals seemed to thrive in their new accommodations, far happier on the ice than they had been in their cramped shipboard kennels. Life settled into a rhythm. Men rose at 7 in the morning, though in the depth of Antarctic winter, 7 a.m. was as dark as midnight. They ate breakfast together, then dispersed to their various duties. The scientists conducted their observations and experiments. Worsley calculated the ship's position as it drifted slowly with the pack. Hurley spent hours in his darkroom developing photographs. McNish worked in his carpenter's shop, building furniture and making repairs. The seamen maintained the ship, scraping, cleaning, painting, keeping everything in order against the day when Endurance would sail again. Shackleton understood that morale was as important as food and fuel. He organized football matches on the ice, the men forming teams and playing spirited games in the eerie twilight. He instituted regular exercise programs, insisting that everyone spend time outside each day, walking among the pressure ridges or helping with the care of the dogs. In the evenings, the crew gathered in the common areas for reading, conversation, or music. Hussey played his banjo, and men sang along, their voices rising into the darkness beyond the ship's glowing portholes. Special occasions were celebrated with the same ceremony they would have received in civilization. On Empire Day, May 24th, they gathered for speeches and a special dinner. Birthdays were marked with extra rations and toasts. When the sun disappeared below the horizon for the last time in late May, beginning the long polar night, they held a ceremonial farewell to daylight, knowing it would be weeks before they saw the sun again. But beneath the routine and the forced cheerfulness, a deeper anxiety began to grow. The ship was not stationary. Each day, sometimes multiple times per day, Worsley would take observations and plot their position. Endurance was drifting northward with the pack, carried by the currents that flowed beneath the ice. In February, they reached their farthest south point, 76 degrees, 58 minutes, the closest they would ever come to their goal of Vassal Bay. Then the drift reversed, and they began moving inexorably northward. By March they had drifted back to 76 degrees. The ice around them was no longer smooth. Pressure ridges formed as the pack compressed, great walls of broken ice thrust upward by unimaginable forces. The smooth white plain that had initially surrounded the ship transformed into a chaotic landscape of jagged edges and towering obstacles. The dogs could no longer move freely between their igloos. Men walking on the ice had to watch their footing carefully, scrambling over ridges that reached 10 or 15 feet high. The sounds became unsettling. The ice groaned and cracked constantly, deep rumbling noises that came from below and all around. Sometimes the noises were sharp, like rifle shots. Other times they were long and low, like the moaning of some enormous beast. The ice was never still, never silent. It moved and shifted continuously, grinding against itself, compressing and releasing in cycles driven by winds and tides and forces that remained invisible to the men. In April, as autumn came to Antarctica and temperatures plummeted, the pack became even more violent. On April 14th, Shackleton recorded that the nearby pack was piling and rafting against the masses of ice. If the ship were caught in such disturbance, he noted grimly, she would be crushed like an eggshell. They could only watch and hope that the particular floe to which Endurance was frozen remained stable. May brought the darkness. The sun, which had been circling the horizon for weeks, growing lower each day, finally disappeared. The polar night descended, and for the next few months there would be no true daylight, only a dim twilight for a few hours around noon, then darkness again. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero Fahrenheit, sometimes colder. Men who went outside for more than a few minutes returned with ice crystals frosted on their beards and eyebrows. Exposed skin would freeze in seconds. Yet life continued. The crew had adapted to darkness as they had adapted to everything else. They read by lamplight, worked by lamplight, navigated the ice by lamplight and the pale glow of the aurora australis that sometimes danced overhead. The dogs, surprisingly, thrived. They were huskies and malamutes, bred for exactly these conditions, and the cold seemed to invigorate rather than harm them. Worsley continued his navigational calculations, and the news remained consistent. They were drifting north, moving at roughly 7 miles per day when winds were favorable, slower when the pack was compressed. By late May, they had drifted to approximately 75 degrees south. They were still deep in the Weddell Sea, still surrounded by hundreds of miles of pack ice in every direction, but they were moving steadily farther from their intended destination. Shackleton began considering alternatives. If, when the ice finally released them, they were too far north to reach Weddell Bay, perhaps they could land somewhere else on the coast. There were other inlets, other potential landing sites. The transcontinental journey would be longer, more difficult, but not impossible. He shared these thoughts with Wild and Worsley, the three men spending long hours in Shackleton's cabin studying charts and discussing options. June passed in darkness and cold. July brought the first hints that winter was loosening its grip. The temperature rose slightly. The period of twilight around midday grew longer. On July 22nd, men watching from the deck saw the ice begin to move in new ways. Not just the slow drift they had grown accustomed to, but actual separation. Cracks appeared. Leads of dark water opened and closed. The pack was breaking up. For a few days, spirits soared. If the breakup continued, if the ice around them fractured, Endurance might be freed. They could fire up the engines and push north to open water, then reassess their options. But the breakup was not controlled or gradual. It was violent and terrifying. On August 1st, a southwesterly gale struck with ferocious power. The wind howled at speeds that made it difficult to stand upright on deck. Snow flew horizontally, reducing visibility to mere feet. And the ice, instead of simply breaking apart, began to move with destructive force. Pressure ridges thrust upward all around the ship. Massive blocks of ice rose slowly, then toppled, crashing down with sounds like artillery fire. The floe to which Endurance was frozen began to splinter. Shackleton watched in horror as mountains of ice rose beneath the ship's keel. Endurance was forced upward, listing heavily to port as ice was driven underneath her hull. The deck tilted at a sickening angle. Men grabbed for handholds to avoid sliding across the planking. The pressure was immense, forcing masses of ice beneath and around the ship, lifting her higher, squeezing her hull with forces that no wooden vessel, no matter how strongly built, could withstand indefinitely. For hours the assault continued. The men could do nothing but wait and hope. Then, as quickly as it had begun, the gale subsided. The pressure eased. Endurance settled back onto a more even keel. The ship had survived, though her timbers groaned with the stress they had endured. The weeks following the August gale were relatively quiet. The ice continued breaking up, but slowly now, without the violent compression that had threatened to crush them. They drifted through a landscape of fractured floes and open leads, still trapped but no longer in immediate danger of being squeezed to destruction. The temperature rose. The sun climbed higher each day. Spring had arrived in Antarctica, and with it came cautious hope. But September brought a return of the pressure. On September 30th, Endurance experienced what Shackleton described as the worst squeeze we had experienced. The ship was caught between two massive floes that ground against each other with the ship trapped in between. Worsley recorded the sensation as being thrown to and fro like a shuttlecock a dozen times. The hull shuddered and twisted. Timbers groaned. Men listened in fear for the sound of wood splintering, which would signal the beginning of the end. Again, they survived. The pressure released before catastrophic damage occurred. But everyone understood now that survival was a matter of luck as much as strength. The ship might withstand 10 such assaults, or 20, but eventually the ice would win. It was not a question of if but when. October arrived, Antarctica's spring progressing toward summer. The pack around them continued breaking up, but Endurance remained trapped, frozen into a floe that refused to fracture. They drifted northward day after day, moving through a seascape of broken ice and occasional open water that they could see but not reach. On October 24th, everything changed. The floe in which Endurance was frozen collided with another massive floe. The impact drove immense pressure against the ship's starboard side. The hull began to bend. Timbers that had withstood months of lesser pressure now cracked with sounds like gunshots. Planks splintered. The starboard side pushed inward, the hull shape distorting under forces that no ship could resist. Water began pouring in below the waterline. The pumps were started immediately, men working in shifts to keep ahead of the incoming sea. But the damage was extensive. More seams opened. More water poured in. The pumps could not keep pace. For 3 days and nights the crew fought desperately to save their ship. They pumped continuously, working until they collapsed from exhaustion, then forcing themselves back to the pumps after brief rest. They attempted to shore up the damaged hull from inside, McNish and his carpenter's mates working waist-deep in freezing water, trying to patch holes and reinforce broken timbers. But the ice had inflicted mortal wounds. Endurance was dying. On October 27, 1915, at temperatures below 15 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, Ernest Shackleton gave the order to abandon ship. Their position was 69 degrees, 5 minutes south, 51 degrees, 30 minutes west. They were 346 miles from the nearest land, Powlett Island, where Shackleton knew a hut and food cache had been established during an earlier expedition. Those 346 miles lay across some of the most treacherous ice and open water in the world. The crew began transferring everything salvageable from the dying ship onto the ice. The 3 lifeboats were lowered first. They named them after the expedition's 3 primary financial backers, the James Caird, the Dudley Docker, and the Stancomb Wills. Tents, sleeping bags, food supplies, fuel, tools, weapons, and scientific instruments were piled onto sledges and dragged away from the ship. Hurley salvaged what he could from his darkroom, heartbreakingly smashing hundreds of glass photographic plates and keeping only the best 120, the maximum weight he could justify carrying. Shackleton made the most difficult decisions of his life during those October days. The dogs, who had been their companions for nearly a year, who had brought joy and purpose to the darkest times, could not all be saved. There was not enough food to sustain 28 men and 69 dogs through the coming ordeal. Working with Wild and the dog handlers, Shackleton selected the strongest teams to keep and ordered the rest shot. Men wept openly as they carried out this grim task. McNish's cat, Mrs. Chippy, who had lived aboard the ship since Buenos Aires and had become a ship's mascot, was also destroyed. One of the surgeon's pet dogs, a young pup, met the same fate. By October 30th, everything that could be saved had been removed from Endurance. The ship sat canted over in the ice, her hull shattered, her mast still standing but crazily angled. She was taking on water steadily now, settling lower hour by hour. The crew made a rough camp on the ice nearby, pitching tents and organizing their supplies while Shackleton planned their next move. For 3 weeks the wreck remained afloat, a ghost ship haunting the ice near their camp. Hurley continued photographing it, capturing haunting images of the broken vessel with the dogs sitting on the ice watching their former home die. Men made trips back to the wreck to retrieve additional supplies as various items were recognized as necessary. The ship became their warehouse, their connection to the world they had left behind. On November 21, 1915, the end came. The wreck, which had been slowly settling, suddenly broke free of the ice and plunged beneath the surface. One moment she was there, listing heavily but still recognizable as Endurance. The next moment she was gone, pulled down into the black depths of the Weddell Sea. She sank stern first, the bow rising high out of the water in those final moments before she disappeared. The men stood on the ice watching silently. Some removed their hats. Several openly wept. Shackleton, standing beside Wild, watched his ship vanish. With Endurance went any hope of completing the transcontinental crossing, any hope of glory or fame or the achievement that had driven him south. What remained was something more fundamental, the imperative to keep 28 men alive and somehow get them home. They had named their camp Ocean Camp, a flat expanse of ice that seemed more solid than the surrounding pack. Here they would wait, Shackleton decided, hoping that the drift of the pack ice would carry them closer to land or to open water where they could launch the boats. He had ordered the attempt to march overland to Powlett Island abandoned after just 2 days, when they had managed to cover barely 2 miles. The ice was too rough, the boats too heavy. Pulling them by man-hauling across pressure ridges was simply impossible. Better to wait, to preserve their strength, and to let the drift carry them north. The men settled into yet another routine, this one more desperate than any before. They lived in tents on the ice, their world reduced to canvas walls and sleeping bags and whatever food they could hunt. Seals became their primary sustenance. The creatures hauled themselves onto the ice to rest, and men with rifles would approach carefully, trying not to spook them before they could take a shot. A good-sized seal provided meat for days. Its blubber could be burned for heat and light. Even its bones and skin found uses. Penguins supplemented the seal meat. The birds were comical on land, waddling about with an almost endearing clumsiness. But they were also survival, and the men hunted them without sentimentality. Fresh meat became their most valuable commodity, far more precious than the packaged rations that remained from the ship's stores. Shackleton maintained discipline and routine with the same determination he had shown aboard the ship. Men rose at the same time each day. Meals were eaten together. Duties were assigned and completed. The scientists continued their observations as best they could with limited equipment. Worsley calculated their position daily, tracking their relentless drift northward. But uncertainty gnawed at them all. How long would this last? Where would the ice carry them? Would they drift to open water or simply continue circling in the pack until their food ran out? Shackleton shared his plans only with Wild and Worsley, but every man understood the precariousness of their situation. They were living on ice that could crack beneath them at any moment, drifting through a frozen sea hundreds of miles from land, entirely dependent on their leader's ability to find a way to safety. December came, the height of the Antarctic summer. The sun circled overhead continuously now, providing endless daylight but little comfort. On December 20th, Shackleton calculated they had drifted to a point where Powlett Island lay about 250 miles away. Still distant, but closer than before. He made the decision to try another march. On December 23rd, the party broke camp and began hauling their boats and supplies across the ice. But conditions had not improved since their first attempt in October. If anything, the spring thaw had made things worse. The surface was soft, men sinking knee-deep with every step. Hauling the boats required exhausting effort, multiple teams working together to move each one just a few yards before needing rest. The pressure ridges remained as formidable as ever, requiring the boats to be unloaded and carried piece by piece over obstacles, then reassembled on the other side. On December 27th, disaster nearly struck in a completely unexpected way. Harry McNish, the carpenter, refused to work. The Dorscott announced that as far as he was concerned, Admiralty law had lapsed when Endurance sank. The crew was no longer under orders. McNish was a free man, and he would decide for himself what work he would and would not do. It was mutiny, plain and simple, and in the most desperate of circumstances. Shackleton reacted with controlled fury. He confronted McNish directly, reminding him that while Admiralty law might be debatable, the ship's articles that every man had signed remained in force. More importantly, Shackleton made clear, survival depended on everyone working together. If McNish would not work for pay or duty, he would work to save his own life and the lives of his companions. The confrontation lasted only minutes, but it was a critical moment. If McNish's rebellion spread, if others decided they too were no longer bound by orders, the fragile discipline that held them together would collapse. Shackleton knew he could not physically force compliance, not out here on the ice. He needed McNish to back down voluntarily. The carpenter, faced with his leader's unwavering resolve and perhaps recognizing the truth of the situation, relented. He returned to work. But Shackleton never forgot the incident. Months later, when recommendations for awards and decorations were being considered, McNish would be denied the Polar Medal despite his subsequent contributions to their survival. Shackleton could forgive, but some things he would not forget. By December 29th, after 7 exhausting days, they had covered just 7.5 miles from Ocean Camp. At this rate, Shackleton calculated, it would take more than 300 days to reach land. It was impossible. They could not sustain such effort for that long. Their food would not last. Their strength would fail. Once again, he called a halt. They established a new camp on what appeared to be a large, stable floe. This time there was no optimistic name. They called it Patience Camp, because patience was all they had left. Here they would wait, conserving their strength, eating what they could hunt, and hoping that the drift would eventually bring them to open water where the boats could be launched. Patience Camp became their home for more than 3 months. Christmas came and went, celebrated with extra rations and half-hearted attempts at festivity. New Year 1916 arrived, marking more than a year since they had entered the ice. The drift continued remorselessly northward, but the direction began to shift slightly eastward as they entered different current patterns. Food became an obsession. Seal hunting was sporadic, dependent on the animals hauling out onto nearby ice. There were days when no seals appeared, and the men went to sleep hungry. Other days they had more meat than they could eat fresh, and strips of seal flesh were hung to dry for future use. The scientists' careful dietary records from earlier in the expedition were abandoned. Survival meant eating whatever they could get whenever they could get it. In January, Shackleton made another difficult decision. The remaining dog teams, except for 2, were shot. The dogs required seal meat, and seal meat was too scarce to share with animals who could no longer serve a useful purpose. The expedition had abandoned any hope of man-hauling heavy loads across the ice. The dogs' working days were over. Feeding them became an unaffordable luxury. It was heartbreaking work. These animals had been companions through the darkest times. They had provided entertainment and affection and a connection to normalcy. Men who carried out the shootings did so with tears streaming down their faces. The 2 remaining teams were kept for another 2 months before they too were destroyed. By April 2nd, every dog was gone. Their meat, added to the human rations, helped sustain the men for a few more weeks. The ice around Patience Camp continued breaking up slowly. Cracks appeared in their floe. Several times they had to move the camp to a more stable section as their floating island fragmented. The pack around them opened up in places, revealing expanses of dark water that seemed tantalizingly close but remained out of reach. They could see where they needed to go but had no way to get there as long as solid ice still surrounded their floe. By March, land was visible. The peak of Mount Haddington on James Ross Island appeared on the horizon, a faint purple outline that looked almost like a cloud. But it was land, solid ground, the first they had seen in over a year. The sight should have been encouraging, but it filled Shackleton with dread. They were drifting past their hoped-for refuges. Powlett Island with its hut and food cache lay too far to the west. Snow Hill Island, another potential salvation, was equally unreachable. Two small islands remained as possibilities. Clarence Island and Elephant Island lay at the northern extremity of the Antarctic Peninsula, right at the edge of where the pack ice typically broke up in summer. If the drift carried them that far, if they could launch the boats when they reached more open water, those islands might be attainable. The alternative was Deception Island, much farther west in the South Shetland Islands. Deception had the advantage of being occasionally visited by whalers and might contain provisions left by previous expeditions. But reaching it would require a much longer boat journey through more dangerous waters. Shackleton wavered between the options, knowing that circumstances would likely make the decision for him. The slow drift northward continued through the early months of 1916, each day bringing subtle changes to their position but no dramatic breakthrough. The ice around Patience Camp evolved constantly, shifting from smooth plains to chaotic jumbles of pressure ridges and back again. The men watched these transformations with a mixture of fascination and dread, knowing that each movement of the pack held the potential for either liberation or disaster. Daily life at Patience Camp fell into patterns that were both monotonous and punctuated by moments of intense activity. Men rose when light permitted, though in these summer months the sun barely set, creating a continuous twilight that made ordinary timekeeping feel arbitrary. Breakfast was whatever seal meat remained from previous hunts, sometimes supplemented by a few precious biscuits from their dwindling stores. The scientists, despite the primitive conditions, continued their observations. Wordie collected rock samples from the few stones trapped in the ice. James recorded magnetic variations. Clark studied the peculiar algae that grew in meltwater pools on the floe's surface, tiny ecosystems thriving in the most improbable places. The seals they hunted were mostly crab-eater seals, despite the misleading name. These animals, which can weigh up to 500 pounds, feed primarily on krill rather than crabs. They were wary creatures, and hunting them required patience and careful stalking. A man would spot a seal hauled out on the ice perhaps 100 yards from camp. He would signal silently to companions. Then began the careful approach, moving slowly when the seal's head was down, freezing absolutely motionless when it lifted to look around. Sometimes the approach took an hour or more. One wrong move, one sound at the wrong moment, and the seal would humph itself back to its breathing hole and vanish beneath the ice. When a seal was successfully shot, it became an event that mobilized the entire camp. The animal had to be dragged back to the tents, butchered, and its various parts allocated. The meat was divided scrupulously among all hands. The blubber was rendered for fuel, chunks of fat simmering over makeshift stoves to produce oil that could be burned in lamps. The skin was cut into strips that might serve 100 purposes, from lashings to patches for boots. Nothing was wasted. Even bones were boiled to extract every calorie and then saved for possible future use as tools or structural elements. Penguins provided variety to the diet, though hunting them stirred more complicated emotions than shooting seals. The birds were comical in their movements, waddling about on the ice with an endearing clumsiness that made them seem almost human. They would approach the camp with apparent curiosity, tilting their heads to study these strange creatures that had appeared in their world. Then a man would swing a club or knife, and the penguin would become food. It was necessary for survival, but some men found it harder to kill penguins than seals. The bird seemed too innocent, too trusting. Shackleton understood the psychological toll that monotony and uncertainty took on his men. To combat it, he maintained routines and created activities that gave structure to their days. Weather permitting, he organized football matches on the ice, using a makeshift ball created from bundled canvas. The games were chaotic and hilarious, men slipping on ice and tumbling into snowdrifts, but they served their purpose. Laughter echoed across the frozen wasteland, a reminder that humanity persisted even here. Evening gatherings in the tents became small ceremonies of normalcy. Men would crowd into the largest tent, packing together for warmth and companionship. Hussey would pull out his banjo, and songs would rise into the Antarctic night. Old music hall numbers, sea shanties, hymns, whatever came to mind. Sometimes they would share stories of home, describing favorite meals or remembered landscapes with a longing that was almost physically painful. Other times they would discuss the expedition itself, endlessly analyzing their situation and speculating about the future. Wild, as second-in-command, served as Shackleton's anchor and sounding board. The two men would spend hours in quiet conversation, discussing options and contingencies. Wild was a man of few words, but when he spoke, people listened. His judgment was sound, his loyalty absolute. Where Shackleton was dynamic and inspirational, Wild was steady and reliable. Together they formed a leadership team that gave the men confidence even in the darkest moments. But not everything was harmony. The close quarters and constant stress inevitably created friction. Men who had been friends aboard the Endurance found themselves irritated by each other's habits and mannerisms. Small things became magnified, minor annoyances transformed into major grievances. The way one man chewed his food. Another's tendency to snore. The scientist who insisted on recording observations when others thought survival should be the only focus. These tensions never quite exploded into open conflict, but they simmered beneath the surface, requiring constant management from the leadership. The weakest animals among the remaining dogs were shot in stages through January and February. Each time, it was a somber occasion. The dogs had names and personalities. They had been companions through the long winter aboard Endurance, through the months on the ice. Shooting them felt like betraying friends. But Shackleton was inflexible on this point. Every seal they killed had to feed either men or dogs. And men came first. The mathematics of survival were brutal but inescapable. On February 2nd, a small party was sent back to Ocean Camp, their original camp near where Endurance had sunk. The wreck site lay about 12 miles away across the ice, and Shackleton hoped they might recover additional food that had been cached there months earlier. Hurley and Macklin volunteered for the journey, along with 2 seamen. They would haul a sledge back, hopefully laden with supplies that could extend their survival time. The 4-man party set out early in the morning, expecting to reach Ocean Camp by afternoon. But the ice had changed dramatically since they last crossed this terrain. Pressure ridges had formed where smooth ice once lay. Leads of open water cut across their route, forcing lengthy detours. What should have been a half-day journey took most of 2 days. When they finally reached Ocean Camp, they found the site barely recognizable. The floe on which it had sat had fractured and refrozen multiple times. Some of their cached supplies had disappeared entirely, presumably lost when cracks opened in the ice. But they salvaged what they could find, several cases of tinned food, some fuel, spare clothing that had been left behind. Most importantly, they recovered additional rope and canvas that might prove essential when they eventually launched the boats. The return journey was even harder than the outward trip. The sledge, now laden with supplies, was heavy and awkward. 2 men pulled while 2 pushed, switching positions every hour to distribute the exhaustion. They slept one night on the ice, huddled together in sleeping bags without a tent, and completed the journey back to Patience Camp on the 3rd day. The supplies they brought were modest, but they represented a small reserve against future need, and that psychological boost was as valuable as the physical goods. February melted into March, and March gave way to April. The Antarctic summer was ending, and with autumn came storms. Great gales would blow across the ice, driving snow horizontally, reducing visibility to 0. During these storms, men huddled in their tents, listening to the wind howl and feeling the canvas walls snap and strain against their moorings. They would emerge after the storm passed to find their world rearranged, new pressure ridges where smooth ice had been, familiar landmarks obliterated. The temperature began dropping as autumn progressed. During their first months on the ice, temperatures had rarely fallen below -10 Fahrenheit. Now they regularly dropped to -20 or lower. Frost formed thick on the inside of the tents. Men's breath created clouds of ice crystals that hung in the still air. Sleeping bags, never fully dry since leaving Endurance, became stiff with frozen moisture. Climbing into a sleeping bag at night was an ordeal, pressing against ice-cold fabric that only slowly warmed from body heat. Frostnip became a constant concern. Exposed skin would freeze in minutes if not properly protected. Men learned to recognize the warning signs, the white patches on cheeks or nose that signaled freezing tissue. They would warm the affected areas with their hands, careful not to rub, which could damage the skin further. Serious frostbite, the kind that led to gangrene and amputation, was mostly avoided through constant vigilance, but minor cases were almost universal. The food situation grew increasingly precarious as April advanced. Seal sightings became rarer. The animals were following their own seasonal patterns, moving to different parts of the pack or diving deeper beneath the ice where humans could not reach them. Days would pass with no fresh meat. The men went to their sleeping bags hungry, their stomachs rumbling with emptiness. Shackleton reduced rations further, stretching their remaining stores as far as possible, but everyone understood the mathematics. If they could not hunt regularly, they would starve. Shackleton began seriously considering whether they should attempt another march. Their current location was drifting them past their hoped-for destinations. Powlett Island was now to the west and slightly south. Reaching it would require backtracking against the drift, which seemed impossible. But perhaps they could aim for Clarence Island or Elephant Island to the north. The pack around them remained dense, but it was breaking up in places. Perhaps they could find a route, drag the boats across the ice, launch them in leads of open water, then haul them onto ice again when the leads closed. He discussed the idea with Wild and Worsley. Wild was skeptical. Their first 2 attempts at marching had proven how difficult hauling the boats was. They were weaker now than they had been then, their food more scarce, the ice no better. But what was the alternative? Wait indefinitely and hope the drift carried them to open water? That could take weeks or even months, and they might not survive that long. The discussion remained unresolved when nature made the decision for them. On April 8th, their world changed in an instant. The crack that split their floe open that evening came without warning. One moment they were eating a meager dinner of seal meat. The next moment, a sound like a gunshot echoed across the ice. Men rushed from the tents to see a dark line of water opening directly through their camp. The crack was widening as they watched, already 3 feet across, then 6, then 10. Everything dissolved into controlled chaos. Supplies stored on one side of the crack had to be dragged across before the gap widened too much. The boats, their lifeline to survival, were on the opposite side from most of the men. Teams formed instantly, hauling equipment and supplies to consolidate everything on the largest remaining section of ice. Shackleton shouted orders, directing the work, making instant decisions about what to save and what to leave behind. Within an hour, their stable floe had become a triangular raft perhaps 200 yards on each side. Around them, the ice continued fracturing. Cracks appeared and widened. Floes collided and ground against each other. The entire pack seemed to be disintegrating at accelerating pace. Shackleton gathered his officers. The decision was obvious. They could not remain here. At any moment their raft might split again, and next time they might not be able to consolidate their supplies in time. They had to launch the boats immediately, even though conditions were far from ideal, even though they were still surrounded by pack ice and had no clear route to open water. The men worked through the night, preparing for departure. The boats were thoroughly checked. Every seam was inspected, every plank tested. Supplies were loaded and distributed among the 3 craft. Shackleton made agonizing decisions about what to take and what to leave behind. Weight was critical. The boats could only carry so much before becoming unseaworthy. Every non-essential item was abandoned on the ice, including personal belongings that men had cherished through months of hardship. The crew assignments were finalized. Each man knew which boat he would be in, where he would sit, what his responsibilities would be. The James Caird, largest and most seaworthy, would carry 11 men under Shackleton's command. The Dudley Docker, captained by Worsley, would carry 9. The Stancomb Wills, smallest and least seaworthy, would carry 8 men nominally under Hudson but with Crean as effective leader. As dawn broke on April 9th, painting the ice in shades of pink and gold, they prepared to leave. The scene was surreal. 3 small boats sitting on a fragmenting ice floe, surrounded by thousands of square miles of pack, 28 men about to set out on a journey with no certain destination and only the slimmest hope of success. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the Dudley Docker pushed off from the ice. Worsley shouted commands to his crew. Oars bit into the water. The boat moved forward, threading between ice floes toward a lead of dark water that beckoned in the distance. 1 hour later, all 3 boats were away, pulling steadily through the pack, leaving Patience Camp behind forever. Those first hours brought a complex mixture of emotions. They were moving again, no longer passive prisoners of the ice drift. They had agency, the ability to choose their course and work toward their goal. That felt liberating after months of helpless waiting. But they were also intensely vulnerable. In the boats, they were exposed to wind, cold, and the danger of collision with ice. If a boat was holed, if it sank, the men aboard would die within minutes in the freezing water. The leads through the ice twisted and turned unpredictably. Sometimes they found clear stretches of water where they could row freely for miles. Other times they barely made any progress, constantly turning, backing, searching for a way forward. When leads closed completely, they would haul the boats onto the nearest solid floe and wait, hoping the ice would shift and open a new passage. The spray from the oars was the first hardship. Every stroke sent droplets flying. The men rowing were soaked within minutes. The water froze on their clothing, creating thick coatings of ice. Within an hour, each man looked like a frozen statue, encased in ice but somehow still moving, still rowing. Their hands froze to the oar handles. They wrapped cloth around the handles, but the cloth froze solid and provided little protection. Night brought new problems. They could not row safely in darkness through ice-choked waters, so they had to find ice floes large enough and stable enough for camping. This was never easy. The pack was constantly in motion, floes grinding against each other, splitting apart, rafting over each other. What appeared stable in afternoon might be fractured by midnight. Several times they had to scramble to move camp in darkness when the floe they were on began breaking apart. Food in the boats was limited to what they could carry and what they had managed to hunt before departure. There was no way to cook. Everything was eaten cold. Seal meat, frozen solid, had to be gnawed and chewed until jaws ached. Biscuits, softened slightly by holding them in mouths, provided some variety. Water was available from ice chunks, but it had to be melted in mouths, a slow process that left them perpetually thirsty. Sleep was almost impossible. The boats were cramped, men packed together with no room to stretch out. The constant motion of the ice beneath them created sounds that kept everyone on edge, grinding and groaning that could signal imminent danger. When they did manage to doze, it was fitful rest interrupted by cold and discomfort. By the second day, exhaustion was already becoming a factor. Men who had been weakened by months of reduced rations and stress were now working their bodies to the limit, rowing for hours, hauling boats onto ice, setting up and breaking camp, rowing again. The physical demands were enormous, and they had no reserves to draw upon. On the third day, Shackleton announced his decision. They would aim for Elephant Island. Deception Island was too far, required too long a journey through open ocean that they might not survive. Elephant Island, while still distant and offering no guarantee of rescue, was reachable. Perhaps. If they could find a route through the pack. If the weather held. If their strength lasted. If. Worsley plotted the course as best he could from the pitching deck of the Dudley Docker. Elephant Island lay roughly northeast of their current position. The ice pack extended in every direction, but satellite observations from decades later would show that they were approaching the edge of the pack. Open water lay perhaps 50 miles to the north. If they could reach that open water, if they could navigate across it to Elephant Island, they had a chance. The fourth day brought the worst conditions yet. A storm blew in from the southeast, driving snow and creating waves even within the pack. The boats pitched and rolled sickeningly. Spray combined with falling snow to create an environment of almost total misery. Men bailed constantly, throwing water overboard with any container they could find. The boats were so low in the water that every wave threatened to swamp them. Vincent, one of the seamen, began showing signs of serious hypothermia. He was shivering uncontrollably, his speech slurred, his movements uncoordinated. Shackleton ordered him moved to the center of the James Caird, where other men could press against him, sharing body heat. They wrapped him in a spare sail and took turns rubbing his limbs to maintain circulation. The fifth day brought a slight improvement in weather, but by now all the men were approaching their limits. Hands were cracked and bleeding from the oars and the constant exposure to salt water and freezing spray. Faces were burned by wind and cold. Several men had frostbite developing on toes and fingers. Everyone was dehydrated, exhausted beyond anything they had previously experienced. But Elephant Island was getting closer. By Worsley's calculations, they had covered perhaps 60 or 70 miles from their starting point. The island should be another 40 or 50 miles ahead. One more day, maybe two, if they could maintain their pace and if conditions did not deteriorate further. On April 14th, they spotted land. It appeared first as a dark smudge on the horizon, so faint that men argued about whether it was real or imagined. But as they drew closer, the smudge resolved into mountains and glacier. Elephant Island, massive and real and tantalizingly close. The sight renewed their failing strength. Men found energy reserves they did not know they possessed. The rowing intensified. The boats surged forward through leads in the pack, fighting for every yard gained. But the island, while visible, remained stubbornly distant. Hour after hour they rowed, and still it seemed no closer. As afternoon faded toward evening on April 14th, they were still perhaps 20 miles from the island. The men had been rowing almost continuously since morning, with only brief stops to rest aching muscles and bail water from the boats. Their hands were raw and bleeding. Their backs screamed with pain from the repetitive motion. But the sight of land, actual solid land after so many months on ice and water, drove them forward with desperate determination. Shackleton made the decision to continue through the night. The risk of navigating in darkness was substantial, but stopping now, so close to their goal, felt unbearable. They would row through the darkness, guided by the dark mass of the island ahead and by Worsley's compass readings. The three boats stayed close together, close enough that crews could call out to each other, maintaining contact in the darkness. The night was endless. Men took turns at the oars, some rowing while others rested as best they could in the cramped spaces. The darkness was disorienting. Without visual reference points, it became difficult to judge whether they were making progress or simply rowing in place. Waves broke over the bows of the boats, soaking everyone aboard. The temperature dropped well below freezing. Ice formed on the oars, on the sides of the boats, on the men themselves. Dawn on April 15 found them still afloat, still moving, though barely. The island loomed close now, its mountains rising thousands of feet above them, glacier carving icebergs into the surrounding waters. They had been in the boats for nearly 7 days, 170 hours of almost constant exposure to freezing conditions. Every man was at the absolute edge of collapse. But the southern shore of Elephant Island offered no place to land. Vertical ice cliffs dropped straight into the sea. Where cliffs did not block access, massive glacier descended to the water's edge, their faces sheer walls of blue ice. Breakers crashed against rocks, creating surf that would smash a small boat to kindling in seconds. They rowed along the coast, searching desperately for any opening, any beach or cove where they might land. Miles passed with no opportunity. Men who had endured so much, who had come so close, now faced the possibility that the island would reject them, that they would have to turn back out to sea and search for somewhere else to go. Finally, late in the afternoon, the James Caird rounded a rocky promontory and discovered a narrow beach of shingle and sand. It was perhaps 50 feet wide, hemmed in by cliffs and clearly subject to high tides. But it was land. Actual rock and earth, not ice. The James Caird grounded on the beach with a crunch of wood on stones. Men tumbled out into the shallow water, staggering toward the beach on legs that could barely support their weight. Some fell to their knees. Others simply collapsed. Behind the James Caird, the Dudley Docker and Stancomb Wills approached and grounded as well. One by one, 28 men reached solid ground for the first time in 497 days. The emotional release was overwhelming. Men who had remained stoic through months of hardship now wept openly. Some kissed the ground. Others sat motionless, too exhausted to move, too overwhelmed to speak. They had done the impossible. They had survived the ice. They had crossed more than 100 miles of the most dangerous waters in the world in 3 small boats. And they had reached land with every soul intact. But this first beach would not serve as a long-term home, as Shackleton quickly recognized. The tide mark showed that storm surges could inundate their current position. They needed a better location. The next morning, April 16th, Wilde took the Stancomb Wills and a crew of volunteers to explore the coast to the west. This final part of our first chapter of the Endurance story brings us to the threshold of new challenges that await these remarkable men. On April 8, 1916, the waiting ended suddenly and dramatically. The floe upon which Patience Camp sat, which had been their home for more than 3 months, split with a sound like thunder. A crack opened directly through the middle of the camp, separating the tents from much of their stored supplies. Men scrambled to drag everything back together onto the largest remaining section of ice. Within hours, their stable platform had become a small, triangular raft maybe 200 yards across. Shackleton understood immediately that they could wait no longer. The breakup was accelerating. At any moment their tiny ice raft might fragment further, dumping men and supplies into the freezing water. They had to launch the boats now, even though conditions were far from ideal, even though they were still surrounded by pack ice that made navigation treacherous and uncertain. All night they worked preparing for departure. The boats, which had sat on sledges since the abandonment of Endurance, were checked and rechecked. Supplies were loaded and distributed as evenly as possible among the three craft. Every man was assigned to a boat. Shackleton would command the Jane's Caird, the largest of the three at 22.5 feet long. Worsley would captain the Dudley Docker. The Stancombe Wills, smallest and least seaworthy of the trio, was nominally under the command of Hubert Hudson, the navigating officer, but Hudson's mental state had deteriorated during the months on the ice, and Tom Crean would be the effective leader. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon on April 9, 1916, the Dudley Docker pushed off from the ice into open water. An hour later, all three boats were away, carrying 28 men and their pitiful remaining supplies away from the ice that had been their prison for nearly 16 months. Those first hours in the boats were both exhilarating and terrifying. They were moving under their own power again, no longer at the mercy of the ice drift. The men rowed with desperate energy, eager to put distance between themselves and the pack. But the leads through the ice were narrow and constantly shifting. What appeared to be open water ahead would close before they reached it. They would have to backrow, turn, search for another route. Sometimes they made good progress, covering miles. Other times they barely moved at all. The cold was brutal. Spray from the oars froze instantly on the men's clothing, encasing them in sheets of ice. The boats themselves became coated with ice, adding weight and making them sluggish. Men's hands, wet from rowing, froze to the oars. Others used pieces of cloth to protect their palms, but the cloth froze solid and provided little relief. Night brought new challenges. They could not continue rowing in darkness through ice-choked waters. The risk of collision with an iceberg or heavy floe was too great. So they dragged the boats onto ice floes and made camp, setting up tents and trying to get what rest they could while the ice continued its unpredictable motion around them. For 7 days this pattern continued. Rowed during the daylight hours, navigating by Worsley's compass and Shackleton's instinct. Camp at night on whatever piece of ice seemed most stable. Wake in the morning and start again. Food was cold and minimal. They had brought some of the seal meat from Patience Camp, but it was frozen solid and had to be gnawed like jerky. Hot food was impossible. Lighting a fire on a boat or on a small ice floe was too dangerous. The men's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. Clothing that had been soaked with spray and then frozen could not fully dry. Sleeping bags became damp and then ice stiffened. Feet and hands showed signs of frostbite. Several men developed the early stages of hypothermia. Everyone was exhausted, sleep-deprived, and frightened, though most tried to hide their fear. Shackleton barely slept. He moved from boat to boat when they were camped, checking on each man, offering words of encouragement, making sure no one was giving up hope. He rationed food with scrupulous fairness, measuring out portions with the precision of a pharmacist. No man received more or less than his share, including Shackleton himself, though as leader he might have justified extra rations. On April 12, Shackleton made a critical decision. He had been wavering between Deception Island to the west and Elephant Island to the north. Deception offered the possibility of finding supplies or even rescue by whalers. But the men were deteriorating too quickly. They needed land, any land, as soon as possible. Elephant Island was closer. From their position, it was perhaps 100 miles away. In good conditions, the boats could cover that distance in 3 or 4 days of hard rowing. the decision made, Worsley plotted a course. But good conditions did not materialize. The pack remained dense, the leads narrow and treacherous. Winds blew from unfavorable directions, creating waves that made the small boats pitch and roll sickeningly. Men who had never been seasick on the Endurance found themselves retching over the side of the lifeboats. By April 14th, they were exhausted to the point of collapse. That day they spotted Elephant Island in the distance, a dark smudge on the horizon. Land. Solid ground. The sight revived them, giving them the strength to keep rowing. But the island remained stubbornly out of reach. They rowed all that day, through the night, and into the following morning. Men took turns at the oars, some rowing until they literally passed out from exhaustion, their oars trailing in the water while companions pulled them back into the boats and took their places. On the morning of April 15th, after 7 days in the boats, they finally closed with Elephant Island's southern coast. But the shoreline they approached was a nightmare of vertical ice cliffs and breaking surf. There was nowhere to land. They rowed along the coast, desperate for a beach or cove, any place where they could drag the boats ashore. Finally, late in the afternoon, the James Caird, in the lead, rounded a rocky point and discovered a narrow shingle beach. It was perhaps 50 feet wide, hemmed in by cliffs and glacier, regularly swept by high tides. But it was land. Actual rock and sand, not ice. Shackleton's boat grounded first. As it touched the beach, the men didn't wait for it to be properly secured. They tumbled out into the shallow water and staggered up onto the stones. Several fell to their knees and kissed the ground. Others simply collapsed, too exhausted to celebrate. One by one, the other 2 boats arrived and grounded on the beach. They had been in the boats for 170 hours. 7 days and nights of constant exposure to cold, spray, and the desperate effort of rowing through pack ice. They had covered more than 100 miles of the most dangerous waters in the world. And miraculously, impossibly, all 28 men had survived. But they were in terrible condition. Frostbite affected nearly everyone. Some men could barely walk. All were dehydrated, exhausted beyond anything they had previously experienced. That first night on Elephant Island, they camped just above the high tide line on their narrow beach. For the first time in 7 days, they lit fires using driftwood found among the rocks. They melted ice for drinking water, the first fresh water most had consumed since leaving Patience Camp. They heated some of their remaining seal meat and ate their first hot meal in more than a week. But Shackleton knew this beach would not serve as a long-term camp. The high tide mark showed that storm surges could inundate their current position. They needed to find a better location, and quickly. The next morning, April 16th, Wild volunteered to take the Stancomb Wills and explore the coast to the west, looking for a more secure campsite. He returned in the afternoon with good news. 7 miles along the coast there was a long, narrow spit of land, a promontory that jutted out into the sea with beaches on both sides. The northern beach was protected from the prevailing winds. There was ample space for tents and stored supplies. Crucially, the highest ground was well above any conceivable storm surge. With minimal delay, despite their exhaustion, they loaded back into the boats and made the short journey to the new location. They named it Cape Wild in honor of the man who had found it. This would be their new home, though no one knew for how long. Cape Wild offered space and relative shelter, but it remained one of the most desolate places imaginable. The beach was covered in rocks and stones. The only vegetation was some moss and lichen clinging to the rocks in sheltered spots. The wind blew constantly, sometimes as gentle breeze, sometimes as howling gale. The temperature rarely rose above freezing, and nights could drop well below zero. But it was land. And after more than a year and a half on the ice, that fact alone seemed miraculous. The men established camp, pitching tents and organizing their supplies. For the first few days, they simply rested, recovering from the boat journey and allowing frostbitten extremities to begin healing. Shackleton spent those days assessing their situation and planning their next move. The grim reality was inescapable. Elephant Island was uninhabited and almost never visited. The island lay far south of the normal whaling grounds and far east of any shipping lanes. No rescue ship would stumble upon them by accident. If they waited here hoping for rescue, they would die here. There was only one option. Someone would have to make a journey for help. The nearest inhabited place was South Georgia, the same island where they had last tasted civilization 17 months earlier. South Georgia lay 800 miles away across the Southern Ocean, through some of the most dangerous waters in the world. The Drake Passage, which they would have to cross, was infamous among sailors. Waves there regularly reached 40 or 50 feet. Storms could blow up with minimal warning. Ships, real ships with experienced crews, had foundered in those waters. Yet the mathematics of their situation left no alternative. Waiting on Elephant Island meant certain death. Attempting the ocean crossing meant probable death, but at least it offered a chance. The decision was not whether to make the attempt, but who would go and who would stay. Shackleton chose his crew with meticulous care. Each man selected brought specific skills essential for success. Worsley was the obvious first choice. His navigational abilities were extraordinary, and without accurate navigation they would miss South Georgia entirely and sail on into the empty Atlantic until they perished. There would be no second chances, no opportunities to correct course errors. Worsley would have to shoot the sun with a sextant from the pitching deck of a 22-foot boat in the middle of the Southern Ocean, calculating their position with instruments that were designed for use on stable ships. It was an almost impossible task, but if anyone could do it, Worsley could. Tom Crean was the second selection. The big Irishman had proven his worth on Scott's last expedition and through every challenge the Endurance had faced. He was immensely strong, utterly reliable, and possessed an inner calm that could steady others in moments of crisis. When things went wrong, and they inevitably would, Crean could be counted on to keep working steadily while others might panic. McNish was a more complicated choice. The carpenter had rebelled during the march from Ocean Camp, refusing Shackleton's orders. That moment of insubordination had never been fully forgiven. But McNish possessed skills that would prove essential. The James Caird, in her current state, could not survive 800 miles of open ocean. She needed modifications, reinforcements, a deck covering to keep out at least some of the spray and waves. McNish was the only man in the party with the carpentry skills to make those modifications. Personal feelings had to be set aside. Survival required McNish. The final two crew members were John Vincent and Timothy McCarthy, both experienced seamen. Vincent was not well liked among the crew. He was a difficult personality, prone to complaining and sometimes bullying the weaker members of the expedition. But he was strong and knew boats. McCarthy, by contrast, was universally popular, a cheerful presence whose optimism had helped maintain morale through the darkest times. Between them, they would provide the muscle needed for rowing and handling the boat in heavy seas. 6 men would go. 22 would remain on Elephant Island under Frank Wild's command. Shackleton took Wild aside for a private conversation that would determine the fate of all remaining men. The discussion was brief and to the point. If the James Caird succeeded in reaching South Georgia, Shackleton would organize a rescue expedition and return as quickly as possible. But both men understood the odds. The little boat might capsize in a storm. It might be driven off course and miss South Georgia. The crew might freeze or starve before reaching land. Any of 1,000 things could go wrong. If the James Caird failed, Wild had orders to wait until the following spring, September or October of 1916. By then the pack ice would have broken up enough to allow boat travel. Wild should take the two remaining boats, the Dudley Docker and Stancombe Wills, and attempt to reach Deception Island, where whalers occasionally called. It was a desperate plan, requiring Wild to lead his men across another 100 miles of Antarctic waters in boats that were barely seaworthy. But it was better than simply waiting to die on Elephant Island. Shackleton gave Wild 4 weeks of provisions for his 6-man crew. After 4 weeks, if they had not reached land, they would be dead. There was no point in taking more food that would simply go to waste. Better to leave the extra supplies with the Elephant Island party, giving them a slightly better chance of surviving until spring. With the crew selected, McNish began his work on the James Caird. The boat had been built as a standard ship's lifeboat, designed for emergency use in relatively calm waters. She was 22.5 feet long, perhaps 7 feet at the beam, constructed of elm planking on oak frames. She was sturdy enough for her intended purpose, but utterly inadequate for the journey they were about to attempt. McNish raised the boat sides first, adding several inches of freeboard by attaching additional planks. This would help keep water out when waves broke over the boat. He then constructed a wooden framework over the open center section of the boat, creating an arched frame that stretched from the small decking at the bow to similar decking at the stern. This framework was covered with canvas that had been salvaged from Endurance, stretched tight and then painted with a mixture of seal blood, fish oil, and the remaining paint they had brought from the ship. The result was not waterproof in any true sense, but it would keep out the worst of the spray and wind. Inside the boat, McNish installed additional bracing to strengthen the hull against the violent motion it would endure. He created compartments for storing supplies, securing everything with lashings so nothing could shift when the boat rolled. Ballast was added using rocks from the beach, carefully placed to keep the boat stable. Too little ballast and she would be tender, likely to capsize. Too much and she would ride low in the water, likely to be swamped by waves. McNish calculated the balance with the experience of decades at sea, placing each stone with precise intention. The work took nearly 2 weeks, from April 17th to April 23rd. Every man on Elephant Island contributed in some way, gathering materials, holding pieces in place while McNish worked, testing fittings and lashings. It was a community effort, everyone understanding that their own survival depended on the success of this small boat and her crew. While McNish worked on the boat, others prepared supplies. Food consisted primarily of sledging rations, concentrated mixtures of pemmican, biscuits, and sugar that provided maximum calories in minimum weight. They could not take fresh seal meat, which would spoil. Everything had to be non-perishable and capable of being eaten without cooking, since lighting the primus stove in the cramped, heaving boat would be difficult and dangerous. Water presented a particular challenge. They collected pieces of ice from the beach and loaded them into empty oil tins that had been thoroughly cleaned. As the ice melted during the voyage, they would have drinking water. But they also took additional ice blocks, stacked in the boat and secured with lines, providing a reserve supply. Navigation required instruments that were fragile and sensitive. Worsley packed his sextant with obsessive care, wrapping it in cloth and placing it in a wooden box lined with moss for cushioning. Charts of the Southern Ocean were protected in a waterproof case. A compass was mounted in the boat where it could be read easily. Chronometers, essential for calculating longitude, were wrapped and protected as well as possible, though everyone knew they would likely stop working once subjected to the constant motion and salt spray of the voyage. April 24th dawned with reasonable weather. The wind was moderate, blowing from a favorable direction. The sea beyond Cape Wild showed no immediate signs of an incoming storm. Shackleton made the decision. They would depart today. The 22 men who would be staying behind gathered on the beach. There were no speeches, no grand gestures. These were practical men who understood what was at stake. They shook hands. They wished each other luck. Wilde and Shackleton exchanged a look that conveyed everything that did not need to be said. Then the 6 crew members of the James Caird climbed aboard, settling into their assigned positions. Lines were cast off. The boat pushed away from the beach, her bow turning toward the open ocean. Men on the shore watched silently as the small craft grew smaller, disappearing eventually into the immensity of sea and sky. Then they turned back to their camp and the long wait that lay ahead. For Wilde and his 21 companions, life on Elephant Island now began in earnest. Their most urgent need was better shelter. The tents they had were worn and inadequate, offering minimal protection against the winds that constantly swept across the exposed beach. The idea of using the 2 remaining boats as structural elements came from George Marston, the artist, and Lionel Greenstreet, one of the officers. The plan was ingenious in its simplicity. They would build 2 parallel stone walls, about 8 feet apart and 20 feet long. The Dudley Docker and Stancombe wheels would be turned upside down and placed on top of these walls, creating a shelter with the boat hulls forming the roof. The gaps between boats and walls would be filled with moss, smaller stones, and packed snow. Old canvas could be draped over the boats to provide additional protection. The construction took several days. Men weak from months of reduced rations and the recent boat journey nonetheless worked with surprising energy. Gathering stones from the beach, they built the walls 1 rock at a time, fitting each piece carefully to create stable structures. The boats were lifted carefully and positioned on the walls, then secured with lines. Canvas was stretched and weighted down. The entrance was merely a low opening on one end, barely 3 feet high, requiring everyone to crawl to enter or exit. The result was christened the Snuggery, and while it was cramped and dark and far from comfortable, it was infinitely better than tents. Inside, men were protected from the worst of the wind. The temperature remained above freezing due to body heat from 22 men packed into such close quarters. It was, by Elephant Island standards, almost luxurious. The interior was organized with military precision. Each man had an assigned sleeping spot that became his territory. The scientists established a small area for their instruments and observations. The surgeons, Macklin and McIlroy, created a medical corner where they could treat the various ailments that afflicted the group. Supplies were carefully stored and inventoried, every item accounted for. Daily routines were established and maintained rigorously. Men rose at 7 in the morning, though the concept of morning was somewhat arbitrary given that they were now in Antarctic winter, with days growing shorter each week. Breakfast was whatever could be hunted or drawn from their dwindling stores. After breakfast, men dispersed to their assigned tasks. Hunting became the primary occupation. Seals hauled out onto the rocks occasionally, and sentries kept constant watch, ready to alert others when an animal appeared. The shooting of a seal was an event that mobilized the camp. The animal had to be killed with a single shot, butchered quickly, and its meat and blubber distributed. Nothing was wasted. Meat was cut into portions for immediate consumption and strips for drying. Blubber was rendered for oil. Skin was preserved for potential use. Penguins provided additional protein, though hunting them was work that some men found psychologically difficult. The birds would waddle up to the camp with apparent curiosity, tilting their heads and making their peculiar sounds. They seemed almost friendly, certainly unafraid. Killing them felt like betrayal, but survival left no room for sentiment. Penguin stew became a regular meal, the meat somewhat fishy in taste but providing essential nutrition. Wilde managed the stores with scrupulous care, maintaining detailed records of every item consumed. Portions were measured precisely. No favoritism was shown, no extra rations for anyone regardless of position or circumstance. This fairness was essential for maintaining morale and preventing resentment. When food was scarce, and it often was, everyone suffered equally. The days slowly turned into weeks. May passed with no sign of rescue. Men maintained their routines and tried not to think about how long Shackleton had been gone. Surely he had reached South Georgia by now. Surely a rescue ship was being organized. Surely they would see a sail on the horizon any day. But the horizon remained empty, day after day, week after week. As autumn progressed toward winter, temperatures dropped and storms increased in frequency. Great gales would blow across Elephant Island, wind screaming at speeds that made it difficult to stand upright. During these storms, the men huddled in the snuggery, listening to the wind howl and feeling the canvas walls snap and strain. Snow would drift against the entrance, sometimes blocking it completely and requiring someone to dig out before anyone could exit. On June 15, a medical crisis threatened one of their number. Pierce Blackborough, the young Welshman who had stowed away in Buenos Aires, had suffered severe frostbite to both feet during the boat journey from Patience Camp. The injuries had appeared to be healing, but appearances were deceiving. The toes on his left foot had become gangrenous, the tissue turning black and emitting the sickly sweet smell of decay. Macklin and McIlroy examined Blackborough carefully. The diagnosis was grim but unambiguous. If the gangrenous toes were not removed, the infection would spread up his leg and kill him. They had to amputate, and they had to do it soon. But they would be performing surgery in what amounted to a cave lit by candles, using instruments that were far from ideal, with no backup if something went wrong and limited anesthesia. The two surgeons prepared as meticulously as conditions allowed. They laid out their instruments, sterilizing them as best they could with boiling water. They prepared the chloroform, measuring out just enough to keep Blackborough unconscious during the operation but not so much that it would endanger him. They created an operating area at one end of the snuggery, asking the other men to crowd into the far end to give them room to work. On the afternoon of June 15th, Blackborough was laid out on a makeshift operating table created from empty fuel crates and wooden planks. The chloroform mask was placed over his face. He breathed deeply, his consciousness fading. Then, by the flickering light of candles and a single oil lamp, Macklin and McIlroy began their work. The operation took 55 minutes. Working with steady hands despite the primitive conditions, they removed the gangrenous toes cleanly, cauterizing blood vessels to prevent excessive bleeding. The wound was closed with the neat stitches of experienced surgeons. Bandages were applied. Blackborough was moved to his sleeping area to recover. Miraculously, the surgery was a complete success. The wound healed without infection, despite the less than sterile conditions. Within weeks, Blackborough was moving around the snuggery on his hands and knees, helping with daily tasks and maintaining surprisingly good spirits. He joked that he no longer needed to worry about getting athlete's foot on his left toes, since he didn't have any. As June turned to July and July to August, the food situation became increasingly desperate. Seal hunting was sporadic at best. The animals were not hauling out as frequently, and days would pass with no fresh meat. The packaged rations from Endurance were virtually exhausted. Men went to sleep hungry more often than not, their stomachs cramping with emptiness. Wild began seriously planning for the possibility that rescue would not come in time. He examined the two remaining boats, assessing their condition and considering whether they could survive another ocean voyage. He studied his charts, calculating distances and plotting possible routes to Deception Island. He set a tentative departure date of October 5th, hoping to reach Deception before winter fully closed in. By late August, the situation seemed particularly dire. Pack ice had closed around Elephant Island, creating a barrier that would prevent any rescue ship from approaching. Food supplies were at crisis levels. Some men were showing signs of malnutrition beyond simple hunger. Morale was sagging despite Wild's best efforts to maintain discipline and hope. On August 23, Audleys wrote in his diary that they might soon have to consider eating the first man who died. He tried to frame it as dark humor, but the comment reflected genuine desperation. They were reaching the point where catastrophic outcomes were becoming not just possible but probable. And then, on the morning of August 30th, everything changed in an instant. But they had no choice. Shackleton would take one of the boats, the sturdiest of the three, and attempt the crossing. It was an insane idea, a desperate gamble with minimal chance of success. But it was the only idea they had. He chose the James Caird for the voyage, the largest and most seaworthy of the three boats. Then he selected his crew. Worsley would go, obviously. His navigation would be essential. Without precise knowledge of their position and course, they would miss South Georgia entirely and sail on into the empty Atlantic until they died of thirst or exposure. Tom Crean would also go, his strength and unflappable courage critical for the journey ahead. McNish, despite their earlier conflict, was selected because they would need his carpentry skills to modify the boat. John Vincent and Timothy McCarthy, both experienced seamen, rounded out the crew of 6. Frank Wild would remain on Elephant Island in command of the 22 men staying behind. Shackleton took his second-in-command aside and explained the plan. If the James Caird succeeded in reaching South Georgia, Shackleton would organize a rescue mission and return for them. But if the boat failed, if they were lost at sea, Wild should wait until the following spring when the pack ice broke up. Then he should take the remaining 2 boats and try to reach Deception Island, where whalers sometimes called. Shackleton gave Wild 4 weeks. If the James Caird party had not reached land within 4 weeks, they would be dead, and Wild should give them up and act accordingly. For weeks' worth of food for 6 men was all they could spare from the Elephant Island supplies. After that, survival would depend on finding food and water at their destination. McNish immediately went to work preparing the James Caird for ocean travel. The boat had been built as a ship's lifeboat, designed for short-term emergency use in relatively calm waters. It was 22.5 feet long, maybe 7 feet at its widest point, open to the elements except for small decking at the bow and stern. To survive 800 miles in the Southern Ocean, it needed substantial modification. Working with whatever materials they had salvaged from the Endurance, McNish built up the sides of the boat, adding several inches of freeboard. He constructed a wooden framework over the open center section of the boat, creating a kind of curved roof. This frame was then covered with canvas, which was painted with seal blood and fish oil to make it waterproof. The canvas covering was hardly watertight, but it would keep out the worst of the spray and provide some protection from the wind. Ballast was added using rocks from the beach, carefully placed to keep the boat stable. They loaded provisions, for weeks' worth of food, mostly seal meat and the remaining packaged rations. Water was stored in old fuel tins that had been thoroughly cleaned. Additional water came in the form of ice blocks, which they would melt as needed. Sleeping bags, spare clothing, a primer stove, navigational instruments, and a few other essentials were packed into the tiny available space. The work took almost 2 weeks. By April 24th, the James Caird was as ready as she would ever be. The weather on that day was reasonable, with moderate winds and no immediate storm threatening. Shackleton decided they would depart immediately. The men of the Elephant Island party gathered on the beach to see them off. There were no speeches, no ground farewells. Shackleton shook hands with Wild, gripping his friend's shoulder for a moment. Words were unnecessary between them. Then he and his 5 companions climbed aboard the tiny boat. Lines were cast off. The James Caird pushed away from the beach and out into the open water beyond the protection of Cape Wild. The 22 men left behind stood on the beach watching until the small boat disappeared from sight. Then they turned back to their camp and the uncertain vigil that lay ahead. Wilde gathered them together and spoke with quiet authority. They would wait for rescue. They would maintain discipline and routine. They would survive. And when Shackleton returned, they would be ready. Life on Elephant Island settled into a grim routine. The most pressing need was shelter. The tents they had brought from Endurance were worn and inadequate for the constant winds that buffeted the beach. Wilde called for suggestions, and it was George Marston, the expedition artist, and Lionel Greenstreet, one of the officers, who proposed an ingenious solution. They would use the two remaining boats, the Dudley Docker and the Stancombe Wills, as the frame for a shelter. The boats would be turned upside down and placed on low stone walls, creating a crude but effective hut. The space beneath the inverted hulls would provide about 5 feet of headroom and enough floor space for all 22 men to sleep, though they would be packed together like sardines. The work took several days. Men gathered stones from the beach and built 2 parallel walls about 8 feet apart and 20 feet long. The boats were carefully positioned atop these walls. The gaps between the boats and the walls were chinked with moss and smaller stones. Old sails were draped over the boats and weighted down with rocks to prevent them from blowing away. A low opening, barely 3 feet high, served as the door. The result was christened the snuggery, and while it was cramped, dark, and far from comfortable, it was better than tents. Inside, the men were protected from the worst of the wind. Body heat from 22 men in such close quarters raised the internal temperature above freezing, at least slightly. It was, by Elephant Island standards, luxurious. The interior was organized with military precision. Sleeping spaces were assigned, each man having a specific spot that became his territory. Personal belongings, what little each man still possessed, were stored in carefully designated areas. The surgeons, Macklin and McIlroy, established a small medical area in one corner. The scientists continued their observations as best they could with limited equipment. Food remained the dominant concern. Wilde had inherited command of the remaining supplies, which were pitifully inadequate to sustain 22 men for an unknown period. Hunting became a daily necessity. Seals hauled out onto the rocks occasionally, and men with rifles took turns keeping watch, ready to shoot any that appeared. Penguins were more common, and penguin stew became a staple of their diet. Wilde established a carefully controlled rationing system. Every scrap of food was accounted for. Portions were measured with precision. No favoritism was shown. The stores from Endurance were stretched as far as possible, supplemented by whatever could be hunted. Wilde refused to establish long-term food caches. In his judgment, doing so would be admitting that rescue might not come soon, which would damage morale. They would live day by day, maintaining hope that Shackleton would return before their supplies ran out completely. But days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months. May passed with no sign of rescue. June brought the approach of winter, with temperatures dropping and storms increasing in frequency and violence. Still no sail appeared on the horizon. The men maintained their routines, but spirits sagged. Doubts crept in. Had the James Caird reached South Georgia? Were Shackleton and the others even still alive? One personality on Elephant Island caused particular friction. Thomas Audleys, the Royal Marines captain who had been appointed as the expedition's motor expert and stores manager, was not popular with the crew. He was fussy, complained frequently, and often seemed to put his own comfort above the group's welfare. Several times Wilde had to intervene in arguments between Audleys and other members of the party. The tensions never quite exploded into violence, but they simmered constantly, adding psychological stress to the physical hardships. On June 15, a crisis emerged that tested the surgeon's skills under the most primitive conditions imaginable. Pierce Blackborough, the young stowaway who had hidden aboard in Buenos Aires, had suffered frostbite to both feet during the boat journey from Patience Camp. The frostbite had been severe, but in the chaos of survival, treatment had been limited to keeping his feet as clean and dry as possible and hoping they would heal. They did not heal. The toes on his left foot became gangrenous. The blackened tissue began to smell of decay. If the gangrene spread, it would kill him. The only option was amputation. Macklin and McIlroy prepared as best they could for the operation. They had surgical instruments salvaged from Endurance. They had some remaining chloroform for anesthesia. But they had no proper operating room, no sterile environment, no backup if something went wrong. They would perform the surgery inside the snuggery, by the light of candles and a single lamp, with 20 other men pressed into the far end of the shelter to give them room to work. On the afternoon of June 15, Blackborough was laid out on a makeshift operating table created from empty fuel crates. He was given chloroform, the mask held over his face until he lost consciousness. Then, working by flickering lamplight in the dim, cramped space, the two surgeons amputated the toes of his left foot. The operation took 55 minutes. Blackborough remained under anesthesia throughout. The surgeons worked with steady hands, making clean cuts, cauterizing blood vessels, closing the wound as neatly as possible with their limited supplies. When they finished, they bandaged the foot and moved Blackborough to his sleeping spot to recover. Miraculously, the surgery was a complete success. The wound healed cleanly. No infection developed. Within weeks, Blackborough was moving around the snuggery, participating in daily activities, his spirits remarkably intact despite having lost his toes on a frozen beach at the bottom of the world. As winter deepened and July gave way to August, food supplies reached critical levels. Seal hunting had become sporadic. The animals were not hauling out onto the rocks as frequently, perhaps driven away by the constant human presence, perhaps following their own seasonal patterns. The packaged rations from Endurance were nearly exhausted. Men went to sleep hungry more often than not. By late August, Wild was seriously contemplating his fallback plan. If no rescue came soon, they would have to take the two remaining boats and attempt the journey to Deception Island. He began making quiet preparations, checking the condition of the boats, calculating how much of their dwindling supplies they could take with them. He set a tentative departure date of October 5, hoping to reach Deception before winter fully set in. On August 23, conditions seemed particularly dire. The sea around Cape Wild was choked with pack ice that would prevent any rescue ship from approaching. Food consisted of their last reserves of seal meat and a few remaining biscuits. Ortlies wrote in his diary that they might soon have to consider the unthinkable, that they might have to eat one of their own if someone died first. He tried to pass it off as a jest, but the gallows humor reflected genuine desperation. On the morning of August 30, a man on watch for seals was scanning the horizon through binoculars when he saw something that made his heart stop. A sail! Or perhaps the smoke from a ship's stack. He stared, afraid to trust his eyes, afraid it was a mirage or wishful thinking. But no, there it was. A ship! It was heading toward them. He shouted. Men poured out of the snuggery, slipping and scrambling over the rocks to get to vantage points. Yes, definitely a ship. A small ship, maybe a tug or trawler. And it was coming closer. Through the morning mist, the vessel resolved into sharper detail. It was the Yelcho, a small Chilean naval tug, and on her bridge stood Ernest Shackleton. Wild organized the camp with swift efficiency. No time for celebration yet. They had to be ready to leave immediately. The pack ice could close at any moment, trapping the Yelcho just as it had trapped Endurance. Every man gathered his few possessions. The camp was abandoned without ceremony. Personal items that could not be carried were left behind without regret. The Elcho, captained by Luis Pardo of the Chilean Navy, could not approach too close to the beach because of rocks just below the surface. Shackleton stood on deck, counting heads as the boats brought his men out. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 22. Every single man alive. Every single man able to walk or be carried to the boats. The reunion was emotional but brief. There would be time for stories and detailed accounts later. Now they needed to get everyone aboard and clear the area before their luck changed. The last man climbed up the side of the Elcho. The boats were secured. Pardo ordered engines ahead. The tug turned and steamed away from Cape Wild, away from Elephant Island, away from the Antarctic. The rescue had taken 137 days from the moment the James Caird departed. For 4.5 months, Wild had kept his men alive on that barren beach with minimal supplies and no guarantee that rescue would ever come. It was a feat of leadership every bit as remarkable as Shackleton's ocean voyage, and when the full story eventually became known, Wild would receive the recognition he deserved. But what of the James Caird and its 6-man crew? What had happened during those 4 months to bring Shackleton back with a rescue ship? The story of that voyage would become one of the most celebrated feats of small boat seamanship in maritime history. When the James Caird pushed away from Cape Wild on April 24, 1916, the 6 men aboard faced 800 miles of the most dangerous ocean on Earth. The Drake Passage, which separates Antarctica from South America, funnels the circumpolar current through a relatively narrow gap. The result is waves that can reach monstrous sizes and weather that changes with terrifying speed. The prevailing wind was helpfully from the northwest, at least initially, and this allowed the James Caird to make good progress on a northerly course. But the price of that progress was constant misery. The boat was so small and the waves so large that they were perpetually awash. The canvas deck covering kept out some water but not all. Spray from waves breaking over the bow found its way through every gap and seam. Within hours, everything inside the boat was soaked. The sleeping bags, stored beneath the canvas decking, became sodden. The men's clothing froze when they were on deck and remained damp when they were below. Worsley navigated using a sextant, trying to shoot the sun when it briefly appeared between clouds. Taking a sight from the pitching deck of a 22-foot boat was nearly impossible. Worsley would wait for a moment of relative stability, quickly measure the angle, then duck back under cover before the next wave struck. His calculations had to account for the boat's motion, the imperfect horizon, and the crude nature of their conditions. Yet he managed, day after day, to determine their position with remarkable accuracy. The watch system was brutal. 3 men worked the boat at any given time while 3 rested below in the cramped, wet space beneath the canvas. But rest was a relative term. The motion was constant and violent. Sleep came in brief snatches. The cold penetrated everything. Frost formed on the inside of the canvas covering, and chunks of ice had to be regularly knocked away to prevent the covering from collapsing under the weight. Food consisted of cold rations, mostly pemmican and biscuits, washed down with water melted from ice. Lighting the primer stove was a complex operation requiring 1 man to hold the stove, another to pump it, and a third to shield the flame from the wind while heating water for tea or melting ice. Hot drinks became the high point of their days, brief moments of warmth in the ceaseless cold. On the 5th day, May 5th, they faced their greatest test. A gale blew in from the northwest with winds that Shackleton estimated at 60 miles per hour or more. The seas became mountains of water. The James Caird would climb a wave face that seemed nearly vertical, hover on the crest while wind tried to blow her over backward, then slide down into the trough with her bow buried in foam. The men bailed continuously, using every container they had, throwing water over the side as fast as it poured in. At one point, Shackleton looked back and saw what he later described as the largest wave he had encountered in 26 years at sea. A monstrous wall of water, its face streaked with foam, towering above the boat. He shouted a warning. The men grabbed hold of whatever they could find. The wave broke over them with the force of an avalanche. When the water cleared, miraculously, they were all still in the boat. The James Caird had survived, though she was so full of water that only her buoyancy chambers kept her afloat. They bailed desperately, working in shifts, throwing water overboard bucket by bucket until the boat rode high enough to be safe again. 2 days later, on May 7th, disaster nearly struck from an unexpected direction. Ice had been forming on the boat's hull and rigging throughout the voyage, but now the accumulation reached critical levels. The extra weight made the boat sluggish and unresponsive. More dangerously, the ice raised the boat's center of gravity, making her liable to capsize. Men took turns crawling along the sides and onto the canvas deck, using their bare hands to break off chunks of ice and throw them overboard. It was exhausting, dangerous work, but necessary for survival. On May 8th, 14 days after leaving Elephant Island, they sighted land. South Georgia appeared first as a dark line on the horizon, then resolved into mountains and glacier. They had made it. Worsley's navigation had been perfect, bringing them across 800 miles of storm-tossed ocean to a target roughly 100 miles long. A navigation error of even a few degrees, which would have been entirely understandable under the circumstances, would have caused them to miss the island entirely. But their ordeal was not over. South Georgia's coastline was treacherous. The northern shore, where the whaling stations were located, was on the opposite side of the island from where they had made landfall. And a powerful gale was blowing them toward the rocky southern coast. If they were driven onto those rocks, the boat would be smashed to pieces and every man would die within sight of safety. For 2 days they fought the wind and currents, trying to claw their way around the island to reach the northern coast. The men were at the absolute end of their endurance. They had not had proper sleep in 16 days. They were soaked, frozen, and exhausted. Vincent collapsed from exhaustion and had to be pulled into the shelter beneath the canvas. McNish's condition was also deteriorating rapidly. Finally, on May 10th, they found a way through the rocks into a small bay on the south coast. King Haakon Bay was uninhabited and offered no immediate rescue, but it had a beach where they could land, freshwater streams, and protection from the worst of the weather. The James Caird grounded on the shingle. The men practically fell out of the boat onto solid land. For 3 days they remained at King Haakon Bay, recovering and assessing their situation. Vincent and McNish were in no condition to continue. Their strength was gone. McCarthy, though healthier, was also exhausted. That left only Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean fit enough to make another attempt. The whaling stations lay on the north coast, perhaps 30 miles away as the crow flies. Between King Haakon Bay and those stations lay the mountainous interior of South Georgia, a wilderness of glacier and peaks that had never been crossed. No one had even attempted it. The island's interior was unmapped and potentially impassable. But another boat journey around the coast in the James Caird's battered condition seemed equally impossible. Shackleton decided they would cross the island on foot. He, Worsley, and Crean would make the attempt while McCarthy remained at the bay to care for Vincent and McNish. They prepared as best they could with their limited resources. McNish installed screws into the soles of their boots to provide traction on ice. They gathered what food they could carry. They took a small stove, some fuel, and a coil of rope. They had no tent, no sleeping bags, no real climbing equipment. They would walk continuously until they reached the other side or collapsed trying. At 2 o'clock on the morning of May 19th, they set out. The moon was full, providing light to navigate by. They climbed away from the bay, ascending toward the ridge of mountains that formed the island spine. The route was mostly guesswork. They aimed for gaps in the ridgeline, hoping those would lead to valleys descending to the north coast. By dawn they had climbed to about 3,000 feet and could see both coasts. The northern shore, where the whaling stations lay, was visible in the distance. But between them and their goal stood ridge after ridge of mountains. They were traversing terrain that would challenge experienced mountaineers with proper equipment. They had none of that. They had only desperate need and unwavering determination. Throughout that long day and into the night they walked, finding routes where none seemed to exist. Several times they climbed for hours only to reach an impassable cliff or precipice. Then came the heartbreaking process of backtracking, losing all that hard-won altitude, and searching for another way. At one point they found themselves on a steep slope above a valley they needed to reach, but the slope was too steep to climb down safely. Darkness was falling. They could not spend the night exposed on the mountain. Temperatures would plummet. Without shelter, they would freeze to death. Shackleton made a desperate decision. They would slide. They sat one behind the other, Shackleton in front, Worsley in the middle, Crean at the back. They linked arms. Then Shackleton pushed off. They accelerated down the icy slope at terrifying speed, unable to control their direction or velocity, only hoping that the slope would not end in rocks or a cliff. For 2 minutes they plunged downward in what amounted to an avalanche with human cargo. Then the slope gentled. They slowed. They stopped. Miraculously, unhurt. They climbed to their feet, checked themselves for injuries, and started walking again. Through the night they continued, driven by the knowledge that McCarthy, Vincent, and McNish were counting on them, that 22 men on Elephant Island were counting on them, that failure meant the deaths of everyone they had left behind. Early on the morning of May 20th, after 36 hours of continuous walking, they heard something that made them stop in their tracks. A steam whistle. It was 7 o'clock, and the whalers at Stillness Station were sounding the whistle to call the workers to start the day shift. It was the first sound created by humans they had heard since December 1914, nearly 18 months earlier. Renewed by this proof they were close, they continued down through the last valleys. The terrain became less mountainous. They picked up the pace. And then, suddenly, they crested a final ridge and looked down on Stromness whaling station. Buildings. Ships. Smoke from chimneys. Civilization. They descended to the station, arriving at its edge in mid-afternoon. 3 bearded, filthy apparitions, their clothing torn and stained with blubber and seal blood, their faces gaunt and blackened by frostbite. Children playing near the station's edge saw them first and ran away screaming. Workers stopped and stared as the 3 walked into the station. Shackleton asked a boy where they could find the station manager. The boy, not recognizing the famous explorer, pointed toward the main building. They walked there and knocked. A man answered. Shackleton asked to see the manager. The station manager, though Ralph Saul, came to the door. He looked at the 3 ragged men standing before him. Then recognition dawned. "Mr. Shackleton?" he asked uncertainly. "Yes," came the reply. Saul later said that when he heard that single word, spoken in Shackleton's familiar voice, he turned away and wept. That afternoon, a whaler was sent around the coast to King Haakon Bay to retrieve McCarthy, Vincent, and McNish. By evening, all 6 members of the James Caird crew were safe at Stromness. They had baths, their first in nearly 2 years. They ate real food at a table. They slept in beds with sheets. These simple pleasures felt like impossible luxuries. But Shackleton's mind was already on the 22 men still stranded on Elephant Island. He made arrangements immediately for a rescue attempt. The Norwegians at Stromness provided a large whaler, the Southern Sky, and a volunteer crew. 3 days after arriving at Stromness, Shackleton was back at sea, heading south toward Elephant Island. But the pack ice that had plagued the Endurance remained an obstacle. The Southern Sky pushed through relatively open water for days, getting within 70 miles of Elephant Island before encountering dense pack that the whaler could not penetrate. Shackleton had no choice but to turn back. He could see the ice barrier, could see that his men were beyond it, but could not reach them. Back at South Georgia, Shackleton immediately began organizing another rescue attempt. He telegraphed London, requesting that a proper ice-capable ship be sent south. The reply came that nothing would be available before October, which in Shackleton's judgment was far too late. Winter was approaching. The men on Elephant Island could not survive another 3 months. He then traveled to the Falkland Islands and approached the British government representative there. Could they provide a ship? The answer was the same. Nothing available. Shackleton was frantic. His men were alive, they had survived months of hell, and now bureaucracy and the lack of available vessels threatened to doom them when they were so close to salvation. The governments of Uruguay and then Chile proved more helpful. Uruguay loaned a trawler, the Instituto de Pesca No. 1. On June 10th, this vessel departed for Elephant Island with Shackleton aboard. But again, the pack ice defeated them. They got within sight of the island before being forced to turn back by impenetrable ice. A third attempt was made using a wooden schooner, the Emma, provided by a British owner in Punta Arenas, Chile. On July 12, the Emma sailed south. Again they encountered ice. Again they were forced to retreat without reaching the island. By now it was late August, and Shackleton was nearly beside himself. 3 attempts had failed. The Chilean government, moved by the story and impressed by Shackleton's desperate determination, offered one more vessel, the Yelcho, a small steel-hulled tug. She was not designed for ice work, but she was available and her captain, Luis Pardo, was willing to try. On August 25, the Yelcho departed Punta Arenas. Shackleton stood on the bridge as they steamed south, watching the horizon for the ice he had come to hate more than anything in his life. This had to work. There would not be another chance. If they failed this time, the men on Elephant Island would have to winter there with no outside help. Many would not survive. The morning of August 30th brought unexpectedly favorable conditions. The pack ice that had stopped previous attempts was absent. Whether due to winds, currents, or simple luck, the sea around Elephant Island was relatively clear. The Yelcho pushed through scattered floes and closing on the island. At 11:40 in the morning, the fog that had shrouded the sea suddenly lifted. Through the clearing mist, Shackleton could see Cape Wild and the camp where he had left his men more than 4 months earlier. Through binoculars he could see figures moving on the beach. They were alive. His men were alive. The Yelcho could not approach too close to shore, but the men on the island were already launching their boats to come out to the tug. Within an hour, all 22 had been brought aboard. Not a single man lost. After everything they had endured, all 28 members of the Endurance crew had survived. The Yelcho turned north and steamed away from Antarctica. In Punta Arenas, the returning explorers were treated as heroes. Chile's newspapers celebrated the rescue. The Chilean government awarded medals. Crowds gathered to cheer as the gaunt, bearded survivors walked through the streets. From Punta Arenas, the expedition dispersed. Most of the men made their way back to Britain via various routes, arriving in small groups over the following weeks. They returned to a world utterly changed from the one they had left. The Great War was in its 3rd year. The casualty lists from the Western Front contained thousands of names. The polar expedition, which had seemed so important in 1914, now felt like a relic from a different age. Shackleton himself went to Chile's capital, Santiago, and then to New York for a brief lecture tour before finally returning to Britain in May 1917. His arrival was barely noted in the newspapers. The war dominated everything. The story of the endurance of months trapped in the ice and the impossible rescue seemed trivial compared to the slaughter in Europe. Many of the expedition members immediately enlisted or returned to military service. Tom Crean returned to the Royal Navy. Frank Wilde joined the Army. Several of the scientists and officers received commissions. 2 would not survive the war. Timothy McCarthy, who had sailed on the James Caird, was killed in action on the Western Front. Alfred Cheetham, the veteran Antarctic sailor, died when his ship was torpedoed. Several others were wounded. McNish, the carpenter whose skills had been essential to their survival, was denied the Polar Medal on Shackleton's recommendation. The mutiny on the ice, that moment of rebellion during the second march from Ocean Camp, could not be forgotten or forgiven. McNish would spend his later years in poverty, bitter about the expedition and his treatment afterward. Shackleton tried to return to normal life but found he could not. The adventure was in his blood. In 1921, he organized one final Antarctic expedition aboard a ship named Quest. Several members of the old Endurance crew signed on: Wilde, Worsley, Macklin, McIlroy, Hussey, and others. It was like a reunion, the old gang getting together one more time. But Shackleton's health was failing. The years of stress and extreme conditions had taken their toll. On January 5, 1922, while Quest was anchored at South Georgia, the same island where the James Caird had landed nearly 6 years earlier, Ernest Shackleton suffered a massive heart attack. He died in his cabin with Macklin attending him. He was 47 years old. At his wife's request, Shackleton was buried on South Georgia, at the Grytviken Cemetery overlooking the bay. It seemed fitting that he would rest there, in the island that had been both his salvation and his launching point for so many adventures. The simple grave, marked by a cross and a stone, remains there today, visited by the occasional tourist ship or expedition passing through those waters. The transcontinental crossing of Antarctica, the dream that had driven Shackleton south in 1914, would not be achieved for another 40 years. In 1957 and 1958, the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition, led by Vivian Fuchs and Edmund Hillary, finally completed the journey from the Weddell Sea to the Ross Sea via the South Pole. They used tractors and modern equipment, and the journey took 99 days. They succeeded where Shackleton had failed, but their achievement, however impressive, lacked the desperate drama of the earlier attempt. For over a century, the wreck of Endurance lay undisturbed at the bottom of the Weddell Sea. The exact location of the sinking was known with reasonable precision from Worsley's navigational records, but the Weddell Sea is treacherous for surface ships and reaching the wreck site proved impossible for decades. In early 2022, a well-funded expedition using modern ice-capable ships and underwater drones finally located the wreck. The images sent back by the underwater cameras were extraordinary. Endurance sits upright on the seabed at a depth of nearly 10,000 feet, her hull remarkably preserved by the near-freezing water and the absence of wood-boring organisms at that depth. The ship's wheel is still visible. The name Endurance remains legible on the stern. The masts have fallen, but much of the rigging remains tangled on the deck. It looks almost as it did in the last photographs Hurley took before she sank in 1915. The wreck is protected under the Antarctic Treaty as a historic site. Nothing was removed. The images were photographed and filmed, then the expedition departed, leaving Endurance to rest in peace in the cold darkness where she has lain for over a century. The story of the Endurance and her crew has become legend, one of history's greatest survival epics. It endures not because of what Shackleton set out to achieve, but because of what he accomplished in failure. He lost his ship. He never set foot on Antarctica. The transcontinental crossing never happened. But he brought every one of his men home alive. Through leadership, determination, and an absolute refusal to give up, he turned disaster into triumph of a different, perhaps more meaningful kind. Historians still debate what lessons the Endurance expedition offers. It is studied in business schools as an example of leadership under crisis. Military academies analyze Shackleton's decision-making. Psychologists examine how the crew maintained morale through months of uncertainty and hardship. But perhaps the most important lesson is simpler and more human. When everything goes wrong, when circumstances conspire against you, when hope seems lost, you endure. You keep moving forward. You take care of your people. You never stop trying to find a way home. Shackleton's family motto was "By endurance we conquer," and in the frozen hell of the Weddell Sea, those words proved more than empty sentiment. They became a philosophy, a method of survival, and ultimately, the path to an impossible victory. The men who survived the Endurance expedition carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it often, recounting stories in pubs and at gatherings. Others rarely mentioned it, keeping their memories private. But all of them understood they had been part of something extraordinary, something that transcended their individual experiences and became something larger. They had learned what human beings are capable of when pushed to absolute limits. They had discovered depths of courage, loyalty, and endurance they had not known they possessed. And they had seen, in the frozen wastes of Antarctica, that the human spirit is the warmest thing in the coldest place on Earth. As we reach the end of this story, it is worth remembering that the men of the Endurance were not superheroes. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. They complained, they argued, they had moments of fear and despair. But they also pulled together when it mattered most. They trusted their leaders and each other. And in the end, that made all the difference. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, remember the Endurance and her crew. Remember that even in the darkest times, even when trapped in ice with no apparent way forward, there is always hope. There is always endurance. And there is always, somehow, a way home. If you enjoyed this journey through history, please consider liking and subscribing. Share your thoughts in the comments. And join us again as we continue exploring the remarkable stories of human exploration and endurance. Thank you for listening. Sleep well. And remember, by endurance we conquer.